So we're just talking about confidence motions. And the last time a Prime Minister lost a confidence motion, sometimes called a motion of no confidence, because if you lose the confidence motion, then the motion is basically saying it's got no confidence in you. The last time a Prime Minister lost a confidence motion was 1979, when Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan lost a confidence motion. This forced his resignation, triggered a general election, and that's what brought Thatcher into power. So Parliament can not only has the power to defeat a Prime Minister's legislative proposals, it has the power to actually remove them from office. That's important to remember. And finally, of course, there are leadership challenges. There's always the potential for a Prime Minister to be brought down by a leadership challenge by their own party's MPs. So both main parties have mechanisms whereby the parliamentary party, what we mean by the parliamentary party is the MPs of that party, are able to trigger a leadership contest against their leader. So for the Conservatives, 15% of Conservative MPs, currently that's about 48 MPs, need to support a leadership challenge in order to trigger a contest, where then anyone can come forward, any other Conservative MP can come forward and challenge the Prime Minister to become leader of the Conservative Party. Now, if the Prime Minister ceases to be leader of their party because they've been forced out in a leadership contest, they can no longer be Prime Minister as well, because you're only Prime Minister by virtue of being the leader of the party, usually the majority party or the biggest party in the House of Commons. So the party's own MPs can bring down their party as leader of that party as well. And therefore, we should mention again, Thatcher, this was how Thatcher was ultimately removed by her own MPs in 1990. And so therefore Prime Ministers need to be careful not to alienate their own backbench MPs. Yeah, because those backbench MPs could trigger a leadership contest. And they should bear this in mind when making appointments, presenting legislative proposals, etc., etc. So Parliament can be very powerful. It can block a Prime Minister's proposals, it can remove them from office, and a Prime Minister's own party's MPs can trigger a leadership challenge, which brings about their downfall as well. So all of these things the Prime Minister has to bear in mind when they're putting forward proposals to Parliament. They have to consider, is this going to actually get passed? This will be a real constraint on the extent to which they genuinely can, as Hailsham suggests, push through anything they want. They can't. They can only push through what they think is going to get the support, enough support in Parliament, and they cannot rely on the support of Parliament, especially if they're in a minority government. But even in a majority government, they cannot rely even on their own MPs automatically and always supporting every proposal they try to push through. Third body of people I want to look at is the public at large, the UK citizens. And ultimately, I'd argue, a Prime Minister depends ultimately for their power on maintaining public support. And this is for three reasons. Firstly, and most obviously, if they lose support, then their party is likely to lose the general election. And if that occurs, they'll no longer be Prime Minister. So, for example, Gordon Brown arguably was not a particularly popular Prime Minister, and then his party, Labour, lost the election in 2010, and he was no longer Prime Minister. Same thing with John Major. Not a particularly charismatic or inspiring Prime Minister, most historians now agree. And his party lost the election in 1997, meaning he ceased to be Prime Minister as well. So ultimately, if you're not popular, then you're probably not your party's probably not going to win the next general election, and you will no longer be Prime Minister. Secondly, though, even between elections, a Prime Minister's level of public support is important, because if their party's MPs fear that their leader will lose them the next general election, they're likely to remove them from the leadership before this happens. So again, the example of Thatcher is relevant here. Thatcher was removed by her own MPs, not just because they felt she wasn't listening to them and so on, but because they realised she was becoming unpopular with the public, particularly because of the poll tax, a policy she pushed through that was really unpopular. And they realised that her personal unpopularity was likely to cost the party as a whole the next general election. It was likely if she led them in the next general election, they were likely to lose the general election. So they removed her from the leadership before that happened, so that they would have some time to have a more popular leader who might actually win the election for them. So it's not just at election time that a Prime Minister's popularity can cause their downfalls, between elections as well. Their own party decide to bring them down because they're worried about their own popularity. And it's a third reason why a Prime Minister's power depends ultimately on public support, is that if the public clearly demonstrate their opposition to a key policy of the Prime Minister, for example, in a referendum, this can damage a Prime Minister's authority to such an extent they feel compelled to resign. This was obviously the case with David Cameron following the EU referendum, when people voted against, the public voted against his policy of remaining in the EU, and this basically led to his resignation because he felt he could not continue to push through a policy that he himself did not agree with. His own policy was to stay in the EU, the public had rejected it. That was very humiliating for him and led ultimately to his resignation. And remember, this is important because this was just a year after he'd led his party to a surprise victory in the 2015 elections, winning a majority against all expectations. And yet, you know, how quickly things changed after he lost the election. He was basically, his authority had so drained away, he felt he couldn't continue as Prime Minister. So, in conclusion, I would argue that a Prime Minister's powers are far from limitless. There are very real limits and constraints on a Prime Minister's power. Even the two most powerful of recent Prime Ministers, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, have eventually come up against these limits, forcing them to resign in both cases. And ultimately, a Prime Minister's power depends on the size of their majority in the House of Commons and the level of support they have from both their own backbenchers and their cabinet. These factors in turn